I would be really focused on the agentic capabilities of that model because that's the big thing at the time. And that has somehow made its way into 4.7 as well. So I've got to believe it's a distilled version. I just find it hard to believe it's not.
All that and more on today's Mixture of Experts. I'm Tim Hwang, and welcome to Mixture of Experts. Each week, MOE brings together a group of the sharpest minds working at the frontiers of artificial intelligence to help you through the week's news. On this week's episode, we have Chris Hay, Distinguished Engineer, Abraham Daniels, Senior Technical Product Manager for Granite, and Lauren McHugh-Ollende, Program Director for AI Open Innovation. Welcome to you all. So we've got 4 huge stories that we're going to cover today. We're going to talk a little bit about some really interesting results coming out of Gallup about AI adoption in the workplace. We'll talk a little bit about DeepMind's research on harmful manipulation. And we'll talk about a really odd story about a shoe company pivoting into AI. But I want to start first with...
Hi, everyone. I'm Aili McConnon, and I'm with IBM Think News, and I am making a special guest appearance for a special segment today because right after we wrapped recording our regular Mixture of Experts episode, of course, Anthropic dropped a new model, and in this case, Opus 4.7, and I'm lucky today to have Chris Hay, Distinguished Engineer at IBM. Anthropic has said that it has, significant gains, particularly for software tasks, basically letting coders do more complicated tasks more accurately, letting them, doing that independently. That seems to be one of its big selling points. But Chris, what are your initial impressions from starting to play around with it?
So my first thought there is loving it already. So I've been playing with it for about an hour, again, using the Claude Code interface. Probably top tip for anyone using Claude Code who's maybe got some sort of long-running task at the moment. Just escape it out, and Claude Code has a resume mode. So if you just copy the session ID of the resume mode and then launch back into Claude Code, then you're going to be able to set your model to 4.7 without losing your session. So it's a kind of top tip for anybody who's on 4.6 and then want to just continue the session with 4.7. Loving it already, right? So the agentic coding capabilities are significantly better. It's picking up a lot more issues, a lot more bugs. It's a lot more kind of structured on there. So I see a significant improvement in the coding. And again, that's sort of reflected in the benchmarks as well. So if we look at kind of Opus kind of 4.6 there, if you look at agentic coding on a Suite Bench Pro, it was Opus 4.7 is sort of 64%, and Opus 4.6 was 53%. But then Mythos Preview was 77.8. And I think that's probably one of the key things that if I get to start speculating a little bit about the model, then I think there's a little bit of Mythos in there, and I'm happy to expand on that a bit more.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Mythos because I think that, in addition to discussing whether this is a sort of incremental improvement or a big step forward, which it sounds like there's some definite benefits. What's also very interesting is this comes soon and hot on the heels of the Mythos preview, which was released, of course, to only a select few companies. And I found the language even in the release of Opus 4.7 interesting, where it was saying that it was broadly not quite as capable as Mythos, but still better in various regards. So it's this sort of I'm interested in your take on what elements you saw that make you think that maybe Mythos has been infused, as well as, kind of what their strategy from the outside, would seem to be having these two, very close launches, but, a little bit different in what they offer.
Yeah, I think the first thing on my mind is there is quite a jump in the capabilities from 4.6. I think that's something that I think is really evident. I think the other thing is 4.6 was slower, which was interesting, and again, maybe it's just capacity on my machine, but 4.7 is certainly seeming faster at the moment as well, which is starting to make me think, are you distilled this down from Mythos a little bit? But actually, I really think that is what's happened. I think they are doing some sort of distilled version of the Mythos model. So I don't think it's necessarily the same base architecture. Again, happy to be wrong, but it feels like there's Mythos there. And you can kind of see that when you look at the bench comparisons. They're all much closer to the Mythos side of the house as opposed to the 4.6 side of the house. So when you look at the kind of When you go through all the bench, you can see that. The other thing is, if you actually read the system card, and again, I've maybe had about this is dropped for about an hour, all right, but so I haven't had that long to go through the system card, but it's actually very similar to the Mythos one. It actually almost reads as if somebody's taken the Mythos card and then did a copy replace, or more likely just said it to Claude, hey, can you rewrite this as if it's the 4.7? Because a lot of the examples that they give, like the jailbreaks and all that, are actually the Mythos examples, as opposed to the 4.7 examples. And then again, a lot of the comparisons they make are the Mythos comparisons as opposed to the 4.6. And then I think one of the things that I sort of really noticed within the within the system card there is there's certain things like they were saying the external testing that they did there was skipped. That was happened. They didn't have time to do that for 4.7, but they had obviously done that for the Mythos release. There was a lot of examples for the Mythos release as well. So it kind of just feels as if they're like, you know what, these were the results of Mythos. We've distilled it down. We've made it a bit more secure. And therefore, we know that it's good. And again, one of the areas they've really focused on there is in the cybersecurity section, because that was one of the big deals around Mythos. Then they've covered that explicitly in there. And one of the things that they're saying there is, Mythos was able to do this, but we really focused on making sure that you can't do anything too scary. And then they've put the extra safeguards. So if you want to go and do cybersecurity stuff, then you have to apply for that. Now, why would you do that if it was on the 4.6 or the same base as 4.6? That only makes sense as if it's a kind of scaled down, a distilled down version of Mythos. So I really think that's what's going on here. I think we're seeing that early kind of preview class. They're testing out Mythos in a kind of safer way. We're getting the extra capabilities, and you'll build up to a bigger model and better model later.
That's fascinating. And it's because they did, I was struck by that, make a big deal that, it might not be as broadly capable as Mythos, but then, the benefit of that was that, there had been criticism that Mythos was too good at violating some of the cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So, in that specific scenario, better that 4.7 had improved the guardrails, but the language around it was somewhat muddied, which I think you're touching on, that it kind of, there's something going on. And I wonder whether the companies who've had the preview and worked closely, with the Mythos model, whether this is even more clear that the 4.7, if not a clone, is, certainly very closely related.
I'm almost positive of it. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's a distilled of some sort. I mean, and there's other clues there as well, right? Which is like, my favorite in the kind of card there is the model has substantially better vision, when it can see images in greater resolution. That, it's unlikely you fine-tuned yourself into better vision. Do you know what I mean? I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's unlikely, right? And again, some of the things that they're focusing on there is it handles kind of following instructions a lot better. Its long-running tasks are much better. These are all the sort of things that if I was building a new base model, I would be really focused on the agentic capabilities of that model, because that's the big thing at the time. And that has somehow made its way into 4.7 as well. So therefore, it's really designed for agentic capabilities. It's designed for coding, etc. So I got to believe that maybe if I've got to believe it's a distilled version. I just find it hard to believe it's not.
That's very interesting indeed. Does that lead you to believe there'll be a 4.8, Opus 4.8 next, or will we get, will they kind of do something to Mythos to release it more broadly? Or, do you think they continue on this sort of parallel track and of sorts?
I'm convinced there will be a 4.8, because I think one of the things we've got to notice at the moment is that the model releases are fast and furious just now, right? It's we're getting new models pretty much every month at the moment with incremental releases. So and that's because it's everybody's jostling for the top position. Somebody's going to release a new model, they're going to release the next model. So I just think we're going to see more frequent releases. So do they want to, with OpenAI got their whatever their potato fry model is going to be? Is that gonna is I was expecting that to drop just after this, after the last time we had to do one of these emergency pods, right? They released them within an hour or so, right? So I've been keeping an eye on that, but are they going to release Mythos? Not yet. I don't think so. I suspect what they're going to do is just be playing tit for tat in the moment, and then what will happen is they'll release their better model back and forward, and I think the time we will see the next big model release will be like they'll be playing chicken with each other between Spud and between Mythos, right? And whoever thinks they've got the better model, they're going to wait till the first person drops theirs, and then they're going to hit in with their model. And we sort of saw that with the whole cybersecurity thing this week as well. So that's what I think is going to happen there. So we're going to see these minor releases back and forward. Somebody's going to release their big model, and the other's going to respond. Whoever's got the best model will probably be the secondary one.
Excellent. Well, it keeps things interesting and keeps us chatting, so that's always fun. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your take already. Just an hour later on the Opus 4.7. I look forward to hearing, when you get a chance to play with it more, and when we have the next barrage of model drops, how it stacks up.
And I'm gonna teleport back into the original podcast.
I want to start first with an interesting sort of scoop that Bloomberg published earlier in the week, specifically about Apple, who we really haven't talked about for a little bit. I think, I would say for the last few episodes, they have just not popped into the list of topics that we cover each week on MOE. And the news is that Apple is taking another go at AI-driven hardware. And so what they're planning right now is to do their own version on AI glasses, sort of a riff on sort of Meta's Ray-Bans. And it's a product that they want to announce either by the end of the year 2026 or early 2027, with the actual release happening in 2027. And this is going to be part of a three-pronged wearable strategy wherein Apple not just supports glasses, but sort of new AI-enhanced AirPods, and then a camera-equipped pendant, which is maybe a little bit like the kind of product that we've been hearing about from OpenAI. And so I guess maybe, Lauren, I'll start with you. We have seen attempt after attempt at getting AI glasses to be a thing. I guess the question is, why do you think companies are so driven to try to do this? And do you think Apple is going to get it right this time?
Sure. I mean, I think the attempt after attempt makes me really wonder if we're actually going to get this before we get brain-computer interface. You see that as the holy grail of how could you get any closer to intent to action? I think, but maybe one reason they're trying so hard is this will be a nice complement to that. So in general, whenever we have that kind of technology that is an interface, it requires some sort of sensor. So if the glasses become the sensor for the brain-computer interface, then you don't even have to think about what you're seeing. Your glasses are seeing it for you, and then somehow
and it's directly into your head.
Yeah. Well, also, and then there's probably real use cases around things you didn't realize you saw, and your glasses see for you and cause you to think or take note of something or act on something. So I think that's one reason that they could be trying, in theory, if they have a very long view. Honestly, I'm just heartened that they have a long view. The more probable tack they'd take would just be buy this innovation once some other startup has put in all the blood, sweat, and tears and failed and got up again and dusted themselves off, and then they just buy them. So I think it's kind of heartening to see that they're actually investing. I think it's important that big technology companies do that investing so we're not fully reliant on the, passion of only entrepreneurs, and that it's a full ecosystem.
Chris, curious about kind of when you come on the show before, we've talked about new devices. You've tended to be very pro experimentation, right? Well, it could work. Let's have people try all sorts of hardware experiments. I would say, we're not long into the AI revolution, but it seems like still the phone is still winning the game in a really big way. And so I guess, I don't know, as you, who's someone who I would say is kind of a super adopter on some of this stuff, does the prospect of, Apple's AI-driven glasses, is that exciting? Is that something that you'd go out and buy when they announce it?
That is super exciting to me, and the reason it's so exciting is that they have nailed the market in a way that nobody else has, right? We're not talking about I don't need Oakley sunglasses, I don't need Ray-Bans, I don't need some sort of cyborg look from the future, like a ski robot with a ski mask on. That's not what I need. I need to look like Tim Cook. That is the style that they're going after, and I think why hire a great fashion brand when you can have the Tim Cook style glasses, and that seems to be their marketing strategy, and I love it. And again, no heads up display in the glasses. Why would you need that? No, you just wear your AirPods and it's fine. So I'm all in. I think these are going to be the best glasses ever. But on a more serious point, actually, I am enthusiastic, right? Which is I do think Apple will eventually nail this, and it is a natural strategy. We can argue about the Vision Pro. It is a great product. It was just too expensive and a whole lot of other things associated with that. If they can bring that form factor down, they can start to bring things in a kind of in an affordable price for everybody in the same way as they've done with the Apple Watch, which is a huge product, right? Then I think more of these features will come through, and I think Apple will make a great job of that.
Abraham, so one of the things that Bloomberg also got in addition to this scoop about their kind of product roadmap on AI hardware was news that John Giandrea, who formerly was kind of like the sort of the leader on AI for Google and was later recruited to Apple, will now himself be leaving Apple. And I guess the critics' view on some of this stuff is, well, I don't know if Apple really knows what it's doing, right? Like you look at this, it's like a pair of glasses, a pendant. Maybe we add some AI to AirPods. Apple Intelligence has been kind of like arguably like not as successful as they thought it was going to be. I mean, how much of this should we read almost as Apple not necessarily pursuing a grand strategy that we've come to know of them, but they too, I guess maybe in some ways are kind of like sort of feeling their way through the wilderness of AI, and maybe they are kind of making it up as they go along.
Well, yeah. So Apple obviously they haven't invested as much as your Googles or your Microsofts. You can see it in their balance sheets. They kind of took a step back in terms of these massive HPC funded LLM building kind of initiatives. And I think over the last 6 months, they've really kind of repositioned. One, kind of focusing on let's bring in Gemini through Google as opposed to building it in-house. And even though, Vision Pro wasn't necessarily a hit, I think that was more just being a little bit too ahead of the market as opposed to something not necessarily being, right for the community. I think we're still in a little bit of like a, hype cycle, just, trough of delusions or trough of delusions. But I do see this as kind of, what they did with the Apple Watch, where they weren't necessarily first, but they were the best, when hindsight, when you kind of look back. In terms of where the glasses land, I think they've got such a stranglehold in terms of the Apple device, whether it's the watch or the phone. So integrating glasses, I think, really kind of helps them capture a customer base that's extremely loyal to them. And if they can find a way to integrate like the App Store and how actually people use their phones into how people wear their glasses and start to make it a little bit more seamless from the wearables perspective, I think they're gonna, they may not get the, massive upfront kind of adoption or market share, but I think they'll position themselves for something that's going to be a lot more successful than Vision Pros. Personally, I think this is a huge win for Google too, given that Gemini is now the model behind Apple Intelligence. Like, if they could find another way to be able to drive, inference to the Gemini model, I think that's also a huge win. So, yeah, I think what they're doing makes sense. I think they're just kind of taking a long tail view, in terms of how they approach it. So, personally, I'm interested to see what's going to happen. I mean, I'm not a huge wearables in terms of like glasses. I think they're still a little bit too, novel in terms of the use case. But I think in 5 years we'll look back and kind of see, yeah, this was kind of a great move from them.
Yeah, this is actually one of the things I really wanted to get to. Abraham, you kind of raised this interesting thing, both about Gemini, right? Like that Apple has decided that they're going to be the model powering a bunch of this stuff. But also that diverges quite a bit. I guess just to observe that this diverges quite a bit from like the Apple model, right? That you would actually envision that they would want to be as vertically integrated as possible, and that should also include the models. And is it, I don't know, maybe Lauren, maybe I'll kick it back to you. Is like, I'm curious if like you think that's like weird. Like why has Apple decided that it's not going to vertically integrate this critical part of the technology? They vertically integrate everything else, but they sort of decided like on the models, we don't want to spend the money, I guess, in effect, right? They have made just a lot less CapEx on this than other companies.
Yeah. I mean, they do draw a line in their supply chain, and it's typically been more of a hardware line. Like, famously, they pour so much money into their contracts with the manufacturers and Foxconn and don't try to do that part themselves. So I think it kind of speaks to model creation almost being as much of a commodity as hardware itself.
Yeah, and I think that might be the case. I mean, I guess that's maybe the last thing we'll touch on before we move to the next topic is, I guess, Chris, like, this still represents, I think, in some ways, like a really big bet on the part of Apple, right? Which is that kind of like maybe at the end of the day, the model doesn't matter all that much, and that they have like so much cash that they can just keep taking lots of shots on goal with the hardware, and maybe they just crack it at some point, and that's kind of all they need to do. And at that point, a little bit like the App Store, they control the gateway for everything. Is there a good reason to believe that that's going to be the case on the AI side as well? Like the model eventually is just kind of a commodity behind the hardware, and so Apple's making the smarter long-term bet, even though right now I think there's a lot of hand wringing about what they're doing.
I think from an AI perspective, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Tim, right? I mean, at the end of the day, Apple's silicon is phenomenal, right? And especially the unified memory on the board. And it is getting faster. And the models are getting smaller and smaller to be able to bring onto device anyway. That's just the general direction of the industry. So and Nvidia, is what trillions of dollars, and that and we can argue who's really running Nemotron every day, right? That's just not the case, and they're doing fine. Do you know what I mean? Jensen Huang can afford all those leather jackets. He's got
Yeah, he
like a
seems
million
okay.
of them. So I
Yeah.
think it's fine. And so Tim Cook's going to be fine. Apple's going to be fine. However, I think there will come a point where they will either crack the model at some point, or they will just buy somebody who is a model provider at some point. I think that's inevitable. But honestly, at the moment, I don't think they need to make that hit. I think it's more important for them to have one of the frontier models there as opposed to a model that's not quite good enough. That's the kind of Apple standard. So, but I do think that will change over time.
Yeah, the idea of like that they eventually acquire one of the big frontier labs is very interesting. Like the great Apple Anthropic merger of 2030 or whatever. Maybe become something if Apple can really build that the same kind of gateway that they built on something like App Store. So that'll be really interesting to see. There's a study that kind of caught our notice here at MOE. We keep an eye on the ongoing discussion, of course, about AI adoption in the workplace. It's just sort of interesting set of topics about what's going to happen to jobs and what can automate and what will jobs look like in the future. And so this was kind of a fun one, a nice update on sort of some of the recent kind of polling of what workers are seeing in their sort of adoption of the technology. And there are some really interesting stats that are hiding here in the Gallup poll that was recently done. First one is that just to remind ourselves of the scale of how many people are being sort of touched and are using AI on a daily basis. I think the stats that they're saying is that right now, half of employed American adults say they use AI in their role at least a few times a year, which is up from, about 46% last quarter. So it's like rising at a pretty fast rate. And then frequent AI use is also increasing. So 13% of employees now say that they use AI daily, and 28% report that they use it a few times a week or more, right? So the kind of intensity of this use is increasing. I think on the other hand, I think the other interesting stat they'll maybe throw in, and, Abraham, I'll throw it to you to get your thoughts on this, is at the same time, this appears to be like we're using it a lot more, but ultimately, the change is kind of incremental, right? So 65% of employees say that artificial intelligence has improved their productivity and efficiency. But there's no kind of mass reported transformative change in what's happening to jobs right now. And I guess, Abraham, maybe just to kick it over to you with kind of a concrete question. I look at these stats and I'm like, are we already at the equilibrium point with some of this, right? Like the technology has mass distribution, is being used very frequently. We already know what's going to happen in some sense. And what's happening is productivity increases, but jobs are pretty much staying the same. Is that where we're going to be? Is that kind of the AI revolution we were promised?
No, I don't think so. No. I think It's a great report, and I think what I took out of it was, yes, AI adoption is increasing, but it doesn't really separate adoption from the perspective of tasks versus jobs, in my opinion. So I think AI adoption on the ground floor is actually being used, a lot more frequently to be able to support different tasks within a job. But in terms of integrating it into end-to-end systems or job functions as a whole, I don't think it's not necessarily something that can happen overnight. So I think the impact is definitely real, but it's hidden in terms of some of these reports. When you think about redesigning a system, like even today, switching over from one ERP to another ERP system could take, anywhere between 50 to $100 million to 3 years and a team of 100 people. So, some of these actual, systems are, entrenched in, sometimes decades of, process and workflow. So to pick it up and redesign it, I think we've got to give it a little bit more time for organizations to be able to manage that. And there's also just the learning curve, being able to understand how to integrate AI when it comes to, what would be more agentic processes as opposed to, rewrite this email, or can you help me craft this memo, which I think a lot of the kind of day-to-day tasks are when they talk about do people use AI in the workforce. So I generally think it's going to transform how people work. Like I kind of comment in terms of, in early 2000s, there's this idea that you could be a tech company or another company. Or now, if you're not a tech company, you're really not operating. So I think being AI is going to very much be in the same boat, but I think it's just going to take a little bit of time to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think a little bit about, in AI, there's this adage of kind of like the spiky frontier where like it turns out that like AI can do stuff like create like novel math theorems, but it still has trouble kind of like counting the number of R's in strawberry, for instance. And I actually wonder whether or not we're going to also have like the spiky frontier of like AI driven job change as well, where like big parts of the economy are going to just kind of remain the same. There'll be kind of incremental productivity improvements. And then these like kind of slices of the economy will just see like this really bizarre productivity and kind of like job structure change over time. And so, like, for people who are kind of in the industries that are moving slower, they'll almost say, like, nothing's happening in AI. For the people who are in it, they'll be like, everything is changing. And they're kind of both right. I don't know, Lauren, I see you nodding. I don't know if that's like a vision of the economy you buy for the
I don't know.
future.
Yeah. Even for the ones who adopt it and see value right away, I think what this study is suggesting is that, if 65% say they're more productive, and then they cite other research in the study that in the report that says that CEOs are not seeing any improvements in productivity from AI, then the super simplistic view is that all of the value capture from the individuals is going back to them, not to the enterprise. So they're going home early and spending time doing things other than work that they want to do. I mean, I think that's probably too simplistic. I think there's maybe, though, a version where they are saving time and it's not going back to them necessarily in that way, but instead they're reinvesting that time in their human skills. So building human relationships in their organization, being kind of the collectors of tacit knowledge that's not written anywhere. So it's not in any RAG system. So that can be your value add to AI as an employee. And I think a lot of the study focused on kind of fears of people around job concerns. So I think for humans who are using AI, becoming more productive, perhaps their natural tendency is to then think about, okay, let me not clock out early, but maybe let me spend an extra
Like, what
hour
else
or
can I
two,
do?
yeah, per day, being a better human
Mhm.
operator of
Yeah.
this AI. So I think that's one possibility. I think there is the possibility that, we'll move to a 3.5 day work week. That's what Jamie Dimon said is going to happen. I said that 2 weeks ago. And then I also think, the study itself said one of the implications is that maybe the value that individuals are getting is ultimately diluted because the processes at the organization are not optimized for AI. So you could build stuff with AI, but for whatever reason, you can't directly pull that into your work in a way that's super efficient. I think it's probably a little bit of all three. I think that'd be a really interesting area for further research.
Further research, yeah. Yeah, it's very wise, and I never really thought about the kind of AI effect on jobs in this way. I mean, I guess, Lauren, I hear you saying is like the story we're usually told is like you do a thing, the AI replaces the thing, and then you are fired. But I think I buy the reality of like basically like, oh man, more of my tasks are getting automated. I need to find other things to do. And so like kind of like almost like the job transforms as a result of AI, but we don't literally like delete the category because people over net tend to be pretty good at inventing things for them to do, for themselves to do.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
guess, yeah.
I think
Go
that's
ahead.
basic career development that we all do is we get
Yeah.
good at something, it gets easy, and then we're like, oh no, I better
Like,
find
what do I do now?
something else to get good at. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and Chris, I think, I was talking to someone who's an engineer recently, and he's like, yeah, I barely look at code anymore. All I do is like tell the system to do something, it produces some code, I run it to see if it works, I give some comments, and it comes back a little bit later. And so it's kind of like, yeah, like even, like we used to say vibe coding, shouldn't we just say like coding, right? Like it kind of feels like the category has already been transformed. And yeah, it's sort of, I don't know, what do you thought about the poll or whether or not you kind of like buy the story that Lauren and I are telling here?
I mean, first of all, I do agree with you there, Tim. I think the AI is producing, in a code sense, a lot of code very quickly, and you can really get a fast feedback cycle. And I think that's maybe the thing I would focus on in these things, especially with AI today, is that the ability to get your feedback really quickly and then iterate that and try new ideas. On a 3.5 day work week, though, Lauren, I mean, I work for some great companies, and I can't think of a company that would go, "Wow, you're so productive. We're gonna pay you the same amount, and you can just turn up for 3.5 days." I don't I don't see that in corporate America somehow. I That doesn't seem to be the trend that I'm seeing. So, the way I like to think about this is I think there's so much that we need to do in general, right? I've never met a company that is up to date with their backlog or ahead of it, right? Everybody's behind, and there's so much transformation that everybody wants to do or new experiences. I just think it gives the opportunity for us to get through the crowd, the drawl, and actually get to the real value and be able to produce the things that we want. So I think the things that will differentiate organizations, people, etc., over time is gonna be the experience. It's gonna be the design. It's gonna be the product mindset. And I think they are the things that focus and differentiate yourself. And oh, a ducky. I like
Yeah.
duckies.
Sorry
Yeah, I
about
think
that.
too.
But yeah, so that's what I think. I think the way we will change it will be about feedback. It will be about experience, and it will be about design and product. And I think, and it should be about that already. But I think we're just sort of wading in the mud just now, and it means that we don't get to the things we want to get to.
Yeah, Lauren had this comment of you in a moment about like, well, maybe one of your jobs is to kind of be like collecting all the tacit knowledge. I think it's like a really interesting kind of future job function. Like I've been thinking a lot about like what will be the jobs of the future. One of them is just kind of like the documentation of all this tacit knowledge because you can't get the systems to do the task unless you have it. But it's kind of like how is that collected and extracted and structured? It feels like there's almost like a whole new kind of job category there in some ways. All right. So, third topic of today, some interesting research coming out of Google DeepMind. We have been talking, of course, about all the latest new model releases, and at MOE, I've wanted to kind of focus us back a little bit more on some of the like research that's happening, not just kind of the latest feature of the week or the latest model of the week. And this was a really interesting study that DeepMind did, tried to get at the problem of what they call harmful manipulation. And kind of what they're observing is now that we have models that are sophisticated enough to advise people to do all sorts of things. And to the extent that people rely on the sort of judgment, predictions, forecasts, of these models, you might worry not just about the persuasion that they do to get you to make the right decision, but also what they call kind of harmful manipulation, which they describe as exploiting emotional and cognitive vulnerabilities to trick people into making harmful choices. So, Abraham, I want to kick it over to you first, just on terms of like the category of this study is like, this is the kind of thing that starts to make me feel a little bit paranoid when I use ChatGPT or Claude. It's like, am I being manipulated? I guess I am in a certain way. How real do you think is this risk that we're living now in a world where AIs are sophisticated enough to like manipulate us into making hard or bad choices?
I mean, that's a great question. I'm not as much of a pessimist, so I don't necessarily. I'm not. The fear isn't there. Also, this study was, as part of this study, they deliberately were asking LLMs to manipulate the user, and this was pretty like there's this little bit of a sandbox environment in terms of how the experiment was run, but what I would say was really interesting that I found from this is that across specific domains in different regions, you had a different propensity for users to be manipulated. Where individuals in finance, I found a little bit odd, were a lot more susceptible to believing in LLM versus in public policy or somewhere where you're a little bit more steadfast in your belief system. And what I thought was really cool was, so it was done across the US, UK, and in India, and it really correlated with the regional or geographic trust of AI, where India, which doesn't have as much of a fear marker around AI, had a lot more of a belief system or kind of propensity to be kind of motivated in a certain direction, whereas UK typically a little bit more stringent in terms of AI use and kind of AI deployment, was a lot less likely to be manipulated. So I think some of this is just like, obviously regional or geographic based. Some of this is very much LLM based. But as part of the study, they outlined that, which I thought was interesting, and I wish they dug a little bit deeper. But there's not necessarily a correlation between whether a model's attempting to manipulate you and does it actually change the behavior, which I found kind of odd. But no, I think it's honestly it's something to think about, and I think it gives a little bit of weight to, are our safety benchmarks that we do today valuable or as valuable as we kind of give them credit for, or do we have to start thinking about those benchmarks before we deploy the model, but once the model is deployed, are there more kind of social or psychological benchmarks that we have to be able to kind of run, as like this study showed. So yeah, I thought it was a really interesting study. I thought it was a great, DeepMind. I think they did a great job of actually running this and demonstrating some of these inherent risks.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you touch on, I think, like that. I picked up on that one as well, as basically this like fun conclusion about like, well, the model can try to manipulate you a lot, but that doesn't mean it's actually going to manipulate you, which kind of is like the dream of like an incompetent scheming AI that's like, oh, well, I'm going to really try to get Tim to like smoke cigarettes now or whatever. And I'm just like, just quiet down. I need my Excel file, properly formatted or something like that. Is maybe the world that we're living in now. Lauren, this reminds me a lot of kind of discussion that happens, 5, 10 years ago now about sort of social media algorithms. I think there was very similar concern that, oh, these systems have gotten so good at creating, at the time, what was called sort of like the filter bubble. They only put you into the content that you like to see. And isn't that sort of dangerous? Do you think there's something different about AI? Or is this really kind of just, everything old is new again?
I think there's something different. And then I think that doesn't mean that we start over on figuring out how to solve it. So I think the different part is that this is highly customized. It's literally your personalized disinformation generator, if you look at it that way. And it comes to you at a moment when you're most vulnerable in some sense. You're actually seeking out information. You're not, passively scrolling social media on the subway and getting exposed to it. I think where we don't want to start over, though, is what we've done on the media and social media side of disinformation, or maybe not what we've done, but what we've learned, and what we've learned we don't want to do. So there's been a really significant ecosystem built up around fact checking in particular, or at least there was until recently, where we had companies established, we had consortium created of these fact checking organizations. There was a engagement model figured out with media and social media companies. They'd be these kind of third party contractors. Maybe more importantly, there was technology driving this work. So there was actual machine learning algorithms, because it was not all human fact checking. And that's valuable work that we can learn from, both to make sure the information on the internet comes pre-annotated to models when they're learning with that fact-checking information. And then on the output side, that we can build better guardrails for, fail-stop mechanisms. So I think we need to learn from what we've tried, because also that whole ecosystem, the last year and a half, social media companies have decided that that program was not working from them. They've wanted to swing the pendulum the other way to get away from the risk of, or the perceived risk of, censorship. And I don't think we've come to a happy medium on how do you balance censorship or perceived censorship with some sort of objectivity. I don't know the right answer to that. But we haven't come to that medium, but I don't think we should start over that conversation, I think we need to build on where we've gotten in the media and social media context.
Yeah, that's right. And that's kind of where I wanted to point the discussion. So I think it's a great segue is thinking a little bit about, okay, so we just think that there is going to be some risk of harmful manipulation. What does the intervention kind of look like that we want ultimately around some of this stuff? Chris, like, I guess just thinking about other kind of domains in which this happens, if you're going to advertise gambling or advertise cigarettes, right? There's like a label that you slap on it. You say, Surgeon General's warning or, gambling addiction hotline. Will that happen for AI as well? The other thing I think a little bit about is, child restrictions, right? We say, okay, well, you need to kind of prove your age before you use an AI model. Do you think these risks are eventually going to rise to the point where we need those types of controls? And I don't know, what would you like to see in this space if you buy the risk? Yeah.
I would like to see.
Hmm.
And I thought about this a lot, right? And if you think of the cigarette companies and all of that, they have the most bland packaging. You have the big thing there. You need to know what you're looking for, and that's fine. And I've come to the conclusion that what we need to do is, rather than having a professional looking text box, ChatGPT window or Claude window or whatever, which is all looking very like a Google text box or something, what we need is like all AIs to have avatars that are dressed up like GTA gangsters. And when you ask a question, they'll be like, yo, what up? And they gotta speak like that. Because of that point, you're not gonna feel manipulated, which is because you're gonna be in the context of, this is a video game. I'm not talking to a real human being at this point, and therefore it might break that spell in reality. But I think by making a nice little text box and making it all look professional and like Google and whatever, then suddenly we're being lulled into thinking this is a little
Yeah.
creature
Which
at
we
the
could
other
we
end.
could do, right? We could build AIs that are a lot more like clearly artificial, right? And clearly kind of play acting.
Exactly.
I guess the problem though is, your average enterprise doesn't want that, right? Like the reason why
I
these
want that.
systems look the way they do, I guess so, yeah. But I think that's like, I actually think that, like, I mean, you're trying to sell it as a business tool, and that kind of comes with certain expectations. People want it to look like a word processor.
Well,
Um,
we could have the paperclip with the giant eyes back, because then nobody's going to be think Clippy's alive, right? So and you can't go, well, that's not enterprise. Well, it was, my friend. So I think that is the solution, and I think we've, as an industry though, we have done this to ourselves, and the reason we have done this to ourselves is we bought into the AGI hype, etc., and we're like, okay, we're gonna have general intelligence soon. We're gonna have super intelligence. We're growing these creatures. And you know what happened? All the philosophers and all the psychologists came into our domain, right? And we were happy being engineers and scientists. The computer science department at university was the other side of the campus from the psychology department. They were very far away. But by saying, oh, we're creating little humans in a box here, we got all the philosophers and the psychologists. So we did this to ourselves. That's the problem.
We're lucky enough to work for an organization and within an organization where we're pretty exposed to what LLMs and generative AI is and what it isn't. So we can make a little bit more of a discerning kind of thought process when we get an output. I think most people treat these things as truth machines, whereas they're really probability engines. And I think there's a lot of education that needs to be done with the public in terms of what the output of an LLM actually is, i.e., the highest probability of a particular token, based on the previous token, versus, look, this is the source of truth, and you should definitely take this medication for the, particular rash that you typed in. So I just think there's a piece here where there's a little bit of an ownership in terms of the the we need to take on in terms of making sure that we outline what it is when we do drop a new model and share out a press release and talk about all the cool things it can do. We do have to be responsible. It's like what it can't do, and what kind of caution you should use when you do use it for particular use cases. So I think there's some ownership that we have to take there too.
I think the final question here that's sort of looming, I think a little bit is, and this plays out in the debates over stuff like cigarette advertising and gambling advertising as well, which is, I think, Lauren, there's a position which is like, well, it's ultimately dependent on the user, right? Like the user is like asking about these types of things, they're ultimately going to have to be the ones that make the decision. And there always has been that, right? Like even the social media companies, I think, like you said, recently have been like, well, this is not really our responsibility. All we do is we provide the data and the users need to figure it out. And isn't that a great thing? Do you have a view on that? Like, do you think increasingly, like if you are a Google DeepMind, you are an Anthropic, you bear more responsibility for these types of behaviors in your model? And, that should be something that like we expect, like we impose, right? The companies need to do this.
I mean, I think there's a division between the legal responsibility and then the moral responsibility. And I think those do get mixed up in the discussion sometimes. So I forget which company just lost the lawsuit for having an addictive algorithm that the person in the case was saying that they actually became addicted. And so that was a really interesting legal line that got drawn, that there actually is some responsibility for creating algorithms that aren't, in this case, addictive. Before that, it was still a moral, expectation that a lot of users had of these companies is don't give me something that is going to harm me in the long run, even if it benefits me in the short run. So I think things often start as moral obligations or expectations, and then they might get to the point where they're legal. I think maybe right now, some of this discourse is still on like what is legally acceptable, and we need to kind of think more about what should our expectations be as a society on these companies that are, have a lot to gain monetarily, about how to keep things in line. And then maybe that could even become eventually legal responsibilities.
Well, more to come there. We're going to keep an eye on this kind of research. And as we get into the summer, I want to kind of talk more about it on MOE. I'm going to end the episode today with sort of a fun story. This popped up, I think, literally like yesterday. Allbirds, which some of you may actually own a pair of Allbirds shoes. I don't. Was once one of the most successful footwear companies in America. I think it was once valued at about $4 billion. And it has kind of fallen on hard times. The market cap of the company has gone considerably down. And there was a story that got passed around because they announced that they were going to do a pivot. And they were going to move from shoes to becoming an AI compute infrastructure company. Which I think like engendered a lot of raised eyebrows, but seems to have been something that at least the financial markets responded quite well to. So it was valued about $21 million on Tuesday's close and grew a huge amount, jumping the shares from $17 from $3. And so what to make of this, I guess, is a really interesting question. Abraham, I see you smiling. Is every company just going to start rebranding as an AI compute company? I think I should probably become an AI compute company.
I was just going to say,
if this is the kind of performance we're going to see.
well, happy to go in with you if you're up for it. I think this is kind of one. It's very interesting shoe company to do it. Like I know a lot of these Bitcoin mining companies kind of pivoted once Bitcoin dropped below a certain point. Personally, $50 million, I don't know how you're going to be an HPC company, be able to purchase enough and actually, be profitable at that point. But, when in doubt, find a way to stay alive. And Allbirds, have decided to move into this space. So, I mean, outside of the shock and awe, I don't really have a lot to say about it, but hopefully this works out for them. I also think from the HPC perspective, I think it's still a bit inflated right now. Curious as to how everyone's going to find power to support their, data centers, but I guess we'll find out soon enough.
Okay, so we have a bear on this business. Chris, are you a bull or a bear on Allbirds AI?
I'm all for it. Why not?
Of
right?
course. Yeah.
I mean, well, honestly, if we think about it, Amazon was a book company, and then they became a cloud, an infrastructure company. So, why not? And then Google, they started Waymo and things like that. Apple are now into the fashion, luxury lifestyle category as well. So everybody pivots, and I think that's okay. So, and we complain in the past about folks like kind of Kodak, they didn't move with the times, and they kept flogging their product, and Blockbuster, and Allbirds have looked at it and went, you know what, our shoes are more expensive than our company is, so we need to pivot and actually become an AI infrastructure company. And I'm all for that. And they could be massively successful. And then, but funnily enough, if we think of the history of IBM, they were selling pianos and things and cows and stuff. Maybe they weren't selling cows. There was something to do with cows anyway, but there was definitely selling pianos, right? And now, we're an AI company. So if we can go from selling pianos to being an AI company, then so can Allbirds. Good for them.
All right, Lauren, I think you're going to be the tiebreaker here. I guess the challenge that Chris is putting out there to frame up your remark maybe is this as crazy as it seems? Like, or is the idea that you pivot into this actually pretty rational? If you can raise $50 million now, yeah, maybe you should just spend it on compute because, there's high demand there.
I think it's both crazy and rational. So
Okay.
it's definitely a stunt. Like they've identified that in the stock market right now, there's a corner of the stock market that's just prediction betting because we all can place a stock trade with Robinhood. 5-10 years ago, we needed a Charles Schwab account and it was a $5 commission on a $250 stock like they were. So it's a stunt. That said, they're laughing to the bank. So they raised $127 million overnight. That would take a startup 18 months minimum, 18 months of a roadshow with investors, plus a really good pitch. They did all that with no pitch other than I'm guessing like a press release and overnight. I think the big question now about whether this is how rational this is how fast can they logically spend that $127 million? Because if they don't, these overnight fair weather investors are going to disappear and their stock price is going to go right back down. But if they somehow offloaded all of this capital very quickly in a way that makes sense as a strategy for this new business, that could work. And guess what? You can easily blow $127 million on
You
GPUs
certainly
right now. So I think the question is maybe can they actually access those because there is a supply crunch on that. So do they have the right friends in the right places to be able to spend that? Personally, I think that there is a genuine market demand for a better B2C experience for accessing GPUs. The incumbents, the cloud providers right now, riddled with availability issues. So if you can make getting a GPU as easy as getting a shoe, maybe there's something there, but you also have to deeply understand the market, of AI developers is quite different than anyone who wants to buy a unique wool shoe. So
Yeah.
I think if they can get those things right, maybe there's a case.
All right, I'm gonna count that as a bull vote. I think the Bulls win this one on our quick lightning round. Also rational but crazy. A good way to describe the show that we have here at MOE. So, Lauren, Chris, Abraham, thanks for joining us as always. That's all the time that we have for today. And thanks to joining all you listeners. If you enjoyed what you heard, you can get us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and podcast platforms everywhere. And we'll see you next week on Mixture of Experts.
IBM, 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 IBM.